The air in the Sterling Grand Ballroom was a toxic mix of heavy lilies and expensive cold champagne. 1,000 crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. They looked like frozen tears. The floor was polished marble, reflecting the faces of 500 predators in silk suits. Everyone was here to celebrate, everyone was here to watch the crowning of a genius. Julian Sterling stood at the center of the revolving stage. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than a family car. His hair was perfectly slicked back. His smile was a masterpiece of artificial charm. Behind him, a massive LED screen pulsed with the Chimera algorithm. The blue lines of code looked like a digital heart. It was beautiful. It was complex. It was my heart. Innovation is a poem, Julian said into the golden microphone. His voice was smooth as bourbon. And Chimera is my soul. I spent 3,000 nights in isolation to breathe life into this logic. I didn't just write math, I wrote the future. I stood in the dark corridor near the sound booth. My fingers were white as I gripped the edges of my tablet. I was Alara Vance. To Julian, I was a ghost. I was the executive secretary. To the world, I was the girl who fixed his coffee and ordered his haircuts. In reality, I was the one who patched every fatal error in his vision at 3 a.m. I wore a plain black dress from a clearance rack. My shoes were cheap and hurt my feet. To the elite in this room, I was just a piece of furniture that knew how to type. Julian adjusted his platinum cufflinks. He looked toward the shadows where I stood. His eyes didn't show gratitude. They showed ownership. Even my secretary Alara can witness the struggle, Julian laughed. He gestured vaguely toward me. The cameras swung around. She saw the light under my office door every night. She saw the sacrifice. Alara, come here, don't be shy. The spotlight hit me like a physical weight. It was hot. It was blinding. I blinked, my eyes stinging. The crowd chuckled. A group of socialites in the front row smirked. They saw a tired girl with frizzy hair. They saw a low-class assistant. Come on stage, Alara, Julian insisted. His voice was playful, but his eyes were cold ice. Tell them, who is the true architect of the Sterling future? I walked onto the stage. Each step felt like a mile. My heels clicked against the wood. The sound was lonely. Julian grabbed my arm. His grip was a wound. It was bruisingly tight. He pulled me closer, forcing me into his scented orbit. He smelled like cloying musk and ego. It was suffocating. He is, I said. My voice was a whisper. Julian had threatened to cancel my mother's medical insurance if I didn't play along. Louder, darling, Julian smirked. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. Tell them who saved this company. Julian Sterling did, I said. The lie felt like jagged glass in my throat. The audience erupted in applause. Julian bowed. He loved the sound of clapping hands. It was his drug. He looked at me with pure contempt. Good girl. Now go get me a fresh glass of Krug and try to look happy. You're depressing the investors. Status flip. He was the king of tech. I was his dog. I turned to leave, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and shame. But the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall slammed open. The sound was like a thunderclap. The music stopped. The laughter died. Demonic Caldwell walked into the room. He didn't wear a tuxedo. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it was woven from shadows. He was the founder of Caldwell Global. He didn't play the market, he owned it. He moved like a panther in a forest of sheep. He didn't look at the stage. He walked straight through the crowd. Dominic stopped at the foot of the stairs. He looked at me, not at Julian, just at me. The air around him was cold. It was sharp. It smelled of winter rain and expensive sandalwood. It was the cure for Julian's suffocating musk. Julian's smile faltered. Dominic, you're late for the toast. Dominic didn't answer Julian. He climbed the stairs. He walked directly to me. He stood so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He was a wall of muscle and absolute authority. He looked at Julian's hand, which was still gripping my arm. You're hurting her, Julian, Dominic said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. It was a physical force. Julian laughed nervously. He let go of my arm. We're just celebrating, Dominic. Alara is like family. Dominic stepped between us. He walled me off from Julian's gaze. His presence was overwhelming. He leaned down. His lips were inches from my ear. The architect shouldn't be carrying drinks for a thief, Dominic whispered. The texture of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was possessive. It was aggressive. It was a promise. Dominic turned back to the room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He looked at the massive screen displaying my code. Let's see what's really under the hood, shall we? Dominic said. Dominic's thumb pressed the button on the black remote. The rhythmic blue pulsing of the Chimera algorithm on the massive screen suddenly froze. The digital heart stopped beating. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a physical weight. The only sound was the distant rhythmic hum of the cooling fans behind the walls. The code is beautiful, Julian, Dominic said. His voice was as sharp as a surgical blade. But beauty without logic is just a mask. I've had my team run a simulation on your masterpiece. It fails every time the market volatility hits 5%. Why is that? Why does your soul crash when the real world gets cold? Julian took a sharp, rattling breath. His chest heaved under the midnight blue tuxedo. A single, oily bead of sweat broke through his expensive foundation. It tracked a jagged, pale line through the tan makeup on his temple. He tried to laugh. The sound was like dry leaves being crushed. Markets are unpredictable, Dominic, Julian stammered. He reached for his champagne glass. His fingers trembled so hard the crystal clinked against his heavy platinum ring. Clink, clink. The sound was frantic. Even a genius cannot account for every variable. It's about the spirit of the code. It's about the vision, not just the raw math. The spirit of the code? Dominic stepped closer to the podium. He didn't look like an investor anymore. He looked like an executioner. Then explain line 4000, the recursive probabilistic layer. It is the engine of the entire system. Explain how it handles backpropagation during a liquidity crunch. Tell us how the weights adjust. Julian stared at the screen. The code was a wall of meaningless symbols to him. He looked like a man staring into his own open grave. He pointed a shaking manicured finger at a block of text. It uses a synergy model, Julian whispered. He was drowning in the white heat of the spotlight. The data flows into a feedback loop which creates excellence. It is proprietary logic. You wouldn't understand the high-level intuition. Excellence isn't a coding term, Julian, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his stuttering like a diamond through glass. Julian spun toward me. His eyes were bloodshot. His mask was shattering. Alara, stay out of this. You don't understand the high-level theory. You're just the assistant. Go back to the shadows where you belong. The synergy model he's talking about, I continued, looking directly at the Baroness in the front row, is actually a standard Bayesian inference script. But Julian added a logic gate that he cannot unlock, because the extensible trigger isn't a mathematical constant. It is a personal key. What key? Auditor Thorne asked. He stepped onto the stage holding a thick briefcase. He wore a look of professional disgust. The date of my mother's final surgery, I said, because I am the one who wrote every line of this script, and I have just revoked the master access rights. Julian doesn't have the key because he never had the brain. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath. It sounded like a vacuum. Julian's face went from pale to a bruised purple red. He looked at the crowd. He realized the wound was no longer on me. He was the one bleeding out in front of the world. Suddenly, Julian changed his tactics. He dropped the golden microphone. It hit the floor with a loud metallic thud that echoed to the ceiling. He took a desperate step toward me, his face twisted into a mask of fake hurt and fake devotion. This was the A10 gaslighting wash. Alara, how could you do this to us? Julian's voice dropped into a soft, intimate croon. He forced tears into his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He snapped it open. A 5-carat diamond burned under the chandeliers. I did this for us, Julian whispered. He made sure the microphones caught his words. I knew you hated the attention. I knew your brilliant mind was too fragile for these sharks. I took the fame and the pressure so you could stay safe in your lab. I was building a kingdom for you, Alara. Everything I stole was just a way to secure our future together. He stepped closer. His scent of cloying sweet musk tried to drown out Dominic's sandalwood air. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading gaze. I was going to propose tonight, Julian lied. He held the ring out like a shield. I wanted us to be the power couple of the century. Don't let your ego destroy 3 years of love. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them we are a team. I forgive you for this outburst, honey. I know you're just tired. Julian saw a few women in the crowd murmur. He saw an opening. He tried to reach for my hand. His fingers were cold and damp with sweat, but Dominic moved. He didn't grab Julian. He simply stepped into the path. He was a mountain of charcoal, wool, and raw power. He looked down at the diamond ring as if it were a piece of cheap gravel. You're not building a kingdom, Julian, Dominic said. His voice was a low, terrifying hum. You're building a cage, and your love is just a debt you're trying to force her to pay. Dominic turned to me. He didn't touch me. He just watched me with a dark, expectant hunger. Tell him, Alara. Tell him what your love actually costs. I looked down at the 5-carat diamond sitting in the black velvet box on the floor. It was a cold, sparkling lie. To the audience, it looked like a romantic tragedy. To me, it looked like a bribe for my silence. I stepped forward. I didn't pick up the ring. I stepped over it. The sound of my cheap heel clicking against the stage was louder than Julian's frantic breathing. The only thing more hollow than that diamond, Julian, I said, my voice projecting to the very back of the hall, is your promise. You didn't build a kingdom for me. You built a prison and asked me to decorate the walls with my own genius. You didn't protect me from the sharks. You hid me because you knew that if the light ever hit us both, the world would see that you are just a shadow. You are a parasite in a bespoke suit. The crowd erupted in a wave of shocked whispers. The wound was no longer professional. It was existential. Julian's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany podium to keep from falling. The wood groaned under his weight. His face was a mask of jagged, ugly lines. Alara, please, Julian hissed, his voice cracking like dry glass. Think about the scandal. Think about the company's stock. If you do this, there will be nothing left for either of us. We can still fix this. We can go to the Maldives tonight. Just tell them the code is fine. There was never an us, Julian, I replied. There was only a host and its thief. Auditor Thorne stepped forward then. The sound of his leather briefcase opening was like a guillotine blade being sharpened. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound in legal blue tape. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the light reflecting off the lenses like cold, sharp sparks. Mr. Sterling, Thorne said, his voice flat and professional. This is a formal summons from the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. We are filing charges for massive technical fraud, systemic wage theft, and the intentional manipulation of shareholder reports. We have the intercepted emails between you and your offshore brokers. Given the scale of the Chimera IPO, you are facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal facility. The room went deathly silent. Status flip, the visionary CEO was now a federal defendant. Julian's jaw dropped. He looked at the Baroness, his primary investor. He looked for a hand to hold. He found none. 20 years, Julian whispered. His voice was a pathetic wheeze. Help me. I'm a Sterling. My father sat on your board. The Baroness stood up. She smoothed her silk gown and looked at Julian with pure filtered disgust. Your father was a man of substance, Julian. You are just a typo in the Sterling history. Security, ensure this man does not leave the stage. Dominic stepped closer to me then. He didn't say a word, but his physical presence was a fortress of charcoal, wool, and raw power. I could smell the sandalwood and the cold rain again. It was the cure for the stench of Julian's panic. Dominic pulled a heavy cream-colored document from his inner coat pocket. The vellum was thick and expensive. It felt like history in his hands. Julian's time is over, Dominic announced to the room. His voice was a baritone command that demanded total attention. As of 9 o'clock tonight, Caldwell Global has purchased 80% of the Sterling Group's outstanding debt. I am calling those loans in immediately. The company is in default. It is dead. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Julian started to laugh, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. You destroyed it? You destroyed my legacy? No, Dominic continued, looking directly at me. His gaze was dark and possessive. I am salvaging the engine. This is a capitalization agreement for a new entity, Vance Technologies. I am providing $10 billion in initial funding. Alara Vance is the founder. She is the CEO. She owns 100% of the intellectual property. Every line of code, every patent, and every cent of the recovery belongs to her. Dominic handed me a fountain pen. It was made of solid platinum. It felt heavy and cold in my palm. This was the A11 high-level compensation. I wasn't a secretary anymore, I was the master of the industry. Sign it, Alara, Dominic murmured. He leaned down, his breath ghosting against my ear. The texture of his voice was a low vibration I felt in my bones. Sign it and watch him turn into a ghost. I leaned over the podium. I could hear Julian's ragged, shallow breathing right beside me. He smelled of sweat and old gin. I pressed the pen to the paper. The sound of the nib scratching against the thick vellum was the most satisfying thing I had ever heard. Scritch. Scritch. The signature was final. The Sterling era was dead. The police cruiser's lights flickered against the crystal chandeliers. Red and blue strobes pulsed through the ballroom, turning the palace of glass into a jagged, rhythmic crime scene. The officers didn't hesitate. They gripped Julian's arms with calloused hands. The sound of the heavy, cold steel handcuffs clicking shut was the most honest noise in the room. It was a sharp, mechanical finality. Click. Click. Alara! Look at me! Julian screamed. He struggled against the officers, his midnight blue tuxedo jacket bunching up around his neck, ruining the perfect silhouette he had spent years crafting. His face was a mask of jagged, ugly lines, his expensive foundation streaking with salt and sweat. I gave you everything. You were nothing before me. I am Sterling. You can't arrest a Sterling. I didn't answer. I stood on the stage, the heavy platinum pen still warm in my hand. I felt the texture of the vellum contract under my palm. It was the weight of an empire. Status flip. Julian was no longer a man. He was a glitch being purged from the system. Mr. Sterling, Auditor Thorne said, slamming his final fraudulent stamp onto the company's master ledger. The sound was like a gavel. As of this moment, the name Sterling has been removed from the Federal Registry for Technical Integrity. Your legacy is an empty folder. Your assets are now legal evidence. The first thing was gone: identity. The shareholders, the very people who had worshipped Julian 10 minutes ago, began to move. They didn't move toward him to offer help. They moved toward me like a tide of silk and diamonds. The Baroness was the first. She stepped over the black velvet ring box Julian had dropped. She didn't even look down at the 5-carat diamond as her heel brushed it aside like a piece of gravel. Miss Vance, the Baroness said, her voice dripping with artificial honeyed sweetness. I always knew Julian was the weak link. A pretty face with a hollow mind. My investment remains with the logic, not the name. We should discuss the new board members tonight. My yacht is available. The CFO, Julian's oldest friend and best man at his hypothetical wedding, was right behind her. He held out his business card, ignoring Julian as he was dragged past him. Alara, I have the forensic logs ready for your review. I've already locked him out of the secondary accounts. I was always on your side, really. Julian saw it all. He saw his world vanish in real time. He saw the vultures picking at his bones before his heart had even stopped beating. This was the Path C identity void. He wasn't just losing a job, he was being erased from the human memory of this city. Get him out, Dominic commanded. His voice was a low rumble of ice that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The officers dragged Julian toward the stairs. His heels scraped against the polished mahogany wood. It was a pathetic, rhythmic scratching sound. Scrape. Scrape. He looked back one last time, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, searching for a single friendly face. He found only the cold, glowing screens of 100 phones, recording his downfall. Alara, please, he whimpered. Delete, I said. My voice was a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the hall, it carried like a thunderclap. The heavy gold leaf doors at the back of the hall slammed shut. The sound echoed for a long time. Julian was gone. The only things left of him were the shattered champagne glasses and the cloying, suffocating smell of his musk that was already being replaced by the sharp ozone of the rain outside and Dominic's sandalwood scent. Dominic stepped closer to me then. He didn't reach for my waist in front of the cameras. Instead, he simply leaned down, his presence a fortress of charcoal wool and raw, unyielding power. The wolves are hungry, Alara, Dominic murmured, gesturing to the crowd of socialites trying to catch my eye. Do you want to stay for the feast, or shall we let them starve? I'm done with scavengers, I replied, looking at the Baroness's fake smile. Dominic's eyes darkened with a predatory satisfaction. He held out his arm, not as a protector, but as a peer. Then let's leave the ghosts to their shadows. We walked out through the private VIP entrance. The air outside was freezing, the rain was a wall of silver, washing the filth of the Sterling era into the gutters. Julian was there, huddled in the back of a police van. The rain had already ruined his tuxedo, the silk shirt transparent and clinging to his shivering frame. He looked like a drowned rat. His phone sat in the gutter nearby, the screen cracked and glowing with 100 missed calls from creditors and lawyers. A group of high society guests walked past him to get to their waiting limos. They didn't see him. A woman in a red gown accidentally kicked his cracked phone into the sewer grate. She didn't stop. She didn't apologize. To her, he wasn't Julian Sterling anymore. He was just debris on the street. Social erasure complete. Dominic's black armored SUV pulled up to the curb, its engine a low, powerful purr. The heavy door hissed open. I stepped inside, the luxury leather cool and firm under me. It smelled of power and new beginnings. Dominic sat beside me. He didn't offer a moral lesson. He just looked at the glowing tablet in my lap. The global servers are waiting for your command, CEO, Dominic said. I looked at the Sterling building. High above, through the rain, a team of workers was already on the scaffolding. They were unbolting the massive gold S from the facade. I watched as the letter fell, hitting the pavement with a dull, heavy thud before being kicked toward the trash pile. The Sterling era is over, I said, watching the lights of the building flicker and die in the rearview mirror. It's time for the age of Vance. Dominic took my hand. His grip was tight, his fingers interlaced with mine. I've been waiting for this rain my entire life. The SUV accelerated into the dark, rain-slicked heart of the city. We didn't look back. We only looked forward.
Watching Julian Sterling's multi-billion-dollar ego get literally chiseled off the building while he was tossed into the rain like yesterday's garbage was the most satisfying professional autopsy I've ever witnessed. If you were in Alara's shoes, would you have taken that 5-carat piece offering to stay silent? Or is seeing a fraud in handcuffs worth more than any diamond? Between us, I almost made Julian's login password even more pathetic, but using Alara's mother's surgery date felt like the perfect proof of how deeply he'd bled her life dry.